So we've come to the end of our first section, and we can have some questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Chris. So come to the end of part one. If any of you have any questions, could you please just raise your virtual hand so then I can ask you to come off of mute, or if you wish, you can put it into the chat and I'll ask your question for you. So based on what I've heard so far, does anyone have a question that they would like to put to Chris before we continue? Okay, while we're waiting then for people. So when we talk, Chris, when we talk about high value men, right? This idea that it's just based on assets and how much they make is clearly not accurate. We can't just consider someone high value because of money, surely. So what else comes into that then? No.
What women tend to do is they start looking at personality traits like loyalty, kindness, generosity, things like that. Because just because a man has these assets, if he doesn't have the personality traits, then he's less likely to invest that in you, right? So if they don't see loyalty and kindness and generosity and so on, then he's going to keep those things. There's going to be a danger that he will keep those things for himself and not invest them in his mate and their offspring. So this is something also women tend to look for within the personality of the male. But unfortunately, as we'll see later on in the lecture, that assessment is weakened in low sex ratio environments because women have to take risks now because of the smaller pool of men that they can actually work with to do something. So that assessment isn't as strict as it would be in a different environment. And certainly when women are the scarcer sex, then they can be really acute in assessing men that way, as in, okay, there's a whole bunch of guys now who've got some status, but what kind of guy are you going to be to me if I decide to try to build a family with you? Are you going to be mean with your resources or so on? So now they can be much more choosier in looking for those traits in a male that they want to choose. So there are many other traits that are important, and assessing those traits can change based on whether it's balanced, high sex ratio, or a low sex ratio.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Deborah. Deborah, do you want to come off of mute and you can ask Chris your question?
So my name is Tony. I am...
Oh. Yeah, you don't sound like a Deborah.
No.
Good evening. So I am Deborah's high value man. That way.
Okay.
Right. So my question is, how would it play out if the males in question come from a family makeup where the mother and father have been together for a long period of time, and this has gone through various generations? So how would that play out in this scenario that you are putting forward?
Well, in that scenario, it tends to be that a boy who grows up in that environment will have the tendency to want to create something like that for himself. So he's less likely to be someone who's going to hold off marriage for, until he gets into his 40s. If he's born into this two-parent family and saw a great marriage, pair bonded parents all the way through, he's going to tend to want the same thing. However, there are instincts that can be at play here as well, because we see men who come from that type of background who may get married, but if they have this ability to attract a lot of females, sometimes they're going to do things on the side, while being, married or something like that. That's pretty common as well. As the man gains a higher level of status, there's a tendency for that to happen. You look at some of these wealthy men who do come from, pair bonded, parent relationships, but you'll see them going through a string of women while they had a wife or something like that. So, but there would be a tendency for them to want to recreate what they saw. If it was, a good family, good marriage life, they will tend to want to recreate the same thing and go ahead and get married. But, some of them will do what we know they tend to do.
Okay, I'll come back later with another question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for your question. I was about to call you Deborah again. Thank you very much for your question. There was a question in the chat, Leon, I'll come to you in one moment. I think Kim had asked, curious as to how this relates to intimate partner violence. I'm not sure if it was.
Yeah, it can very much relate to intimate partner violence. Certainly in a high sex ratio environment, so there's less women, more men around, and men are sensitive to that. And so they're going to want to control their woman because they're a scarce resource. So things that may trigger them and think someone's after their woman, they may be more likely to want to control the woman through, intimate partner violence. With the higher testosterone levels, there's just more violence around. And it's not that testosterone makes you violent, but if you're in an environment where control and competition happens in an aggressive context, then you're going to have more violence towards men and towards women. We find this, let's say, in polygynous environments, there's more intimate partner violence against women than in monogamous societies where they have a lot more monogamy. So that can be about control, about fear, but also if the men are polygynous, their testosterone levels stay high because they're continuing to pursue women, even though they already have women. So they're still in the game, that they're still pushing and challenging and contesting to gain more women. And you need testosterone to do that. And that can then lead to, when there are conflicts, if this is how, it's managed through some level of aggression, then violence tends to take place with regard to women and with regard to men, as we'll see.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Kim. I hope that answered your question. We'll just finish with Leona. I know there's a couple of other people that have asked questions in the chat. Perhaps we could ask those after part two, probably. So Leona, if you want to ask your question, please.
Yes, ma'am. Peaceful greetings, everyone. Mr. Gradison, sir, when you were talking about the Chinese Americans and how they had the sex ratios and how when the ratios became better, the violent crimes and, all those good things you listed happened. And I believe in the global system of racism, white supremacy, the white supremacists, they pay very close attention to the behavior of the non-white males. Now, two things. One, given that the United Nations Human Rights Office, the High Commissioner, Article 2, in its definition of genocide, C says, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or part, or imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. These Chinese Americans, the Chinese people that you talked about, and I heard you mention that they were faced with racism, the men, the high volume of men. When they got more women, or rather when the sex ratios balanced out, did that eliminate the impact of white supremacy racism on their relationship? Forgive me if I'm scattered. I'm a little nervous, but
no, I've got what you're saying.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'll go back.
So, well, it was a reduction of racism against them based on the improved relationship between the United States and China, because they had the Chinese Exclusion Act in the late 19th century going into the 20th century. But in World War II, China and the United States became allies against Japan. So you can't have these racist laws against Chinese people in America when now you're an ally to the Chinese nation. So this caused them to change those racist immigration laws and the treatments of Chinese Americans. So once they took those laws away, they started treating them better, and this allowed a lot of Chinese immigration in the mid to late 20th century into the United States. And that immigration was far more women than men. So because their status had changed nation state to nation state, some treatments of Chinese Americans improved also. So you can say there was now less racism being visited upon Chinese Americans. And that's not to say they still weren't experiencing racism. They absolutely were, but it wasn't as extreme as it was in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And then now with lots of Chinese women coming into the country, they could wife up the Chinese men that are there. This could bring down the testosterone levels and improve the family structure and the behavior. And then they could use, the strength of their culture to compete a lot better. But yes, you're right. It is that the institutional and structural power in America changed its approach to Chinese Americans, allowing that improvement to happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Leon. I hope that's answered your question. I did say we'll move on with part 2, but if you could just, because Kim has asked for clarification. So if there's a way that this could be done in like a sentence or 2, that would be great. So Kim has said, sorry, could that be clarified? Are you saying that women are less likely to experience intimate partner violence in their marriages or partnerships if they are in environments with gender balance and monogamy as standard?
Yes, they will. There'll be less of that behavior if they're in a balanced sex ratio in a monogamous society. I'm not saying it's not there, because men do it, whatever it is, whether it's balanced, high, low, whatever. Intimate partner violence is one of the most common forms of violence on planet Earth. So it's a big problem. But in terms of the societies that are doing better with it, it's going to be those balanced, monogamous societies that have lower levels of it compared to those other societies. It's the end of part 2. What I wanted to do there is show the pattern across the globe, across different societies, civilizations, even throughout time. So now when I look at this behavior pattern in the Black context, we don't have to racialize it as much, because what we're tending to do is to say, okay, that's what Black people do, or that's what Black men are doing. But I've just shown you that's men across the planet when you got low sex ratios. And even with the cross-species analysis, we see sexual behavior practices changing when the ratios change. So we can do a Q&A now.
Okay, great. Yes. So what I'll do, while some of you formulate some of your questions, we did have some left over from part 1. Richard had asked, is the key marriage, as you seem to suggest, or the ability to procreate?
Could he clarify that? Key to what?
Is the key marriage, as in, I'm assuming the solution to some of the problems?
Yeah, I can speak on that. So definitely, if I could push a button and have high marriage rates at an early age in our community, I'll definitely do it. All kinds of outcomes improve when men and women get married, stay committed, handle that marriage the right way. A man handles his commitments, a woman handles hers. This is much better environment for children. It makes strong communities. It makes a strong team, and the community will do better when you have that. So I'm not sure how the reproductive part of his question came into it, but if he's asking is the key marriage to clear up a lot of this, absolutely.
I'm a Black woman who's witnessed my fair share of experiences of Black men refusing to date Black women, even if their main caregiver has been their Black mother, where they'll be very open with damaging stereotypes against us and insults towards our looks and features. Can you explain why this is with relation to high value and status and availability? There are plenty of beautiful and successful Black women, so it saddens me a lot.
Yeah, I can answer that in 2 seconds. Just wait for the section that's coming up. We can go to our Q&A right now. I tried to stay logical there, but you could see I got a bit more heat than usual because I'm really concerned about this.
Oh, thank you. There was a lot to take on there. There's a lot of dialogue going on in the chat as well. I think it would be really a question from Nsikan, which I'd been wondering as well. He had said, is the 46:100 ratio for marriageable Black men versus all Black women, or marriageable Black men versus marriageable Black women?
Well, this is about male psychology, because men don't tend to assess women based on their status anywhere near the way men do. I'm not saying they don't do it at all. It's not as emphasized amongst men. And that's why they tend to look at sex ratios like that in every society, because men focus on some other things a bit more than a female's, let's say, educational attainment or status. They tend to focus a bit more on looks and things like that. That tends to play a stronger role in their decision making and their mating habits. So this is why we don't look at, well, where is the educational level of the woman? What is their status? Men don't make decisions the same way that women do based on those status measures there. So this is why we look at the marriageable male to, let's say, you would call it fertilizable women. So we're talking about women who haven't gone through menopause. So we're talking about they've got that fertility window still pretty wide open. So talking about in our 20s and 30s, early 40s, they're talking about that group right there. So that's the stat to look at in comparison to those women. We would call that the operational sex ratio. So you're tending not to include women who are in their 50s and higher. But that really answers that question.
Okay, thank you. So in the same way that there's a marriageable Black man, there isn't really that concept when it comes to a marriageable.
You probably can say that, but it wouldn't be with status. So if you remember the colorism lecture, right, we saw a lot of Black men, the lighter skinned Black women were more likely to be married, more likely to attract a male who's doing socioeconomically better. So again, this is showing you the choices men are making. They're looking at more physical cues a bit more in terms of who they want to place at a certain level to go after and engage in, you know, long-term relationships. So the stat we looked at in the colorism lecture, we saw there were double the amount of light-skinned Black women married compared to dark-skinned Black women. So if with that stat with men, the socioeconomic status would come into it a lot more. But with those women, it didn't seem to matter. You were lighter skinned, you were more likely to attract a higher quality Black mate, more likely to be married. And, you know, this was across, you know, societies. So that's another indicator of how men are making their choices with regard to long-term sexual strategies. They're more likely to engage in it with a lighter skinned Black woman because they're influenced by these Western beauty standards. And yeah, I'd advise people to take a look at that colorism lecture if it's available for them. I mean, it's on my YouTube page, but I think.
Sure. Hi, how y'all doing? So I have a question about okay, the psychology of like you said, I really hate the way the men and women argue amongst each other on the YouTube and just in general. It is destructive, but it seems like you know, Kevin Samuel, he passed away, of course, but he, you know, he really like lit that fuel up too, or just made it worse. And you know, I felt like, what do you think is the psychology behind this? Because to me, it just seemed like if you're a Black man, and we know this is a patriarchal society or world, and you look at Black women as your enemy and not white supremacy, there has to be some type of like deficiency in that man. And so I'm like, the man or his audience, they rather look at Black women as the enemy instead of fighting the real fight, which is white supremacy. Because you, in order to fight it, you have to want to build a Black kingdom, right? You have to want to build strong Black neighborhoods, strong Black communities, and really focus on self. And instead of doing that, they rather take the easy way out, to me, which I consider weak-minded, and say Black women is our enemy. I'd rather just pick a permanent secondary place under white supremacy. And in the case of America, it's such a rich country that, you know, second place is actually not that bad, because it's, you know, you could be a Kanye West, a billionaire, and, you know, he did exactly what the rest of these men do. They get rich and then they go get a white wife. And, you know, it seems like it's just in it, but they say they're pro-Black or they're doing it for the culture. I'm not understanding how you can do that when you marry somebody like a Kim Kardashian. And it just seems, you know, I'm just thinking like it's a psychology of it. And just one other point, when you was talking about, you know, the type of women that the non-Black women get when they marry, when Black men marry out, you know, Dr. Michael Eric Dyson wrote that book, Why I Love Black Women. And one of his chapters, Another Friday Night, and all the Black women are at home, something like that. And he was doing statistics about, you know, as Black men get degrees, bachelor's, master's, PhDs, they definitely marry more outside our race.
Yes.
And, you know, he did like, you know, study on that too. But yeah, just if you give your opinion about the psychology of it, just want to make Black women.
I can say a little, but there's obviously a lot. And, you know, I have to say, go ahead and read my book, because there's a whole lot to, I could do a whole lecture just on your question. That could be a 2-hour lectures. There's a whole lot going on there. So a lot of that we put in the colorism lectures. So about how standards of attractiveness is linked to status, and then men are status seekers. I mean, well, humans are status seekers, but with regard to, you know, their programmable sexual preferences, they're bringing the two together. So because this higher status has been associated with women who are either light skinned, mixed race, or white, and so on, as their status goes up, that's why they're tending to make the decisions like what we saw with Kanye West, and so on. And then to try to justify why they are not with a Black woman, or let's say a certain kind of Black woman. There will be now an attempt to rationalize why they've made these choices. And it has nothing to do with how they've been programmed by this society with anti-Black standards. And so they can tend to make these choices that are against the interests of the community. And then when they make these excuses, they project. So it's nothing about them. They're now projecting onto Black women, as in, well, Black women don't do this, that, and that. And if I'm with a white woman or someone, well, they do these things and you're not doing it. And this is why that, because you've believed the feminist ideology, or you're not doing the things that my mother would do, or so they'll make up all these excuses. And women in general have changed. Society has changed now. So the traditional roles that were going on a century ago, 50 years ago, those have been converting and changing over. And it's not, just Black women, that's women across the board. When a lot of these men are with, these women of another race or something like that, they're dealing with the same issues and problems. They're just not assessing it and judging it the same way. They are more harshly judging their own kind. But there's so much more that we would actually have to talk about there. So in chapter 5 and 6 of my book, where I talked about Black femininity and Black masculinity, we talked a lot about those issues. And then we talked about the prestige bias psychology as well. So there was a lot to actually bring together that causes this phenomenon that, really is unraveling the community and its ability to perform, to gain well-being and success for itself. We're just a team that tends to be tearing itself apart. Now, I would add, the complaints Black women have, a lot of them are legitimate. But as we've seen through the lecture, we have a low sex ratio evoking this behavior pattern out of the men in our community, just as it has in men of other races and other communities presently and throughout time. Now, this is why I said sometimes it's difficult to criticize, because many of us just don't know at the ultimate level what this sex ratio problem can do to a community, to an entire national population. So it's evoking these behaviors out of men that they may be following because it's in their individual interests, but then it's harmful to the family structure, harmful to women. So women are legitimately complaining about it, just like the Latvian women and the Russian women were. But now the Black men are trying to push back those attacks and saying, no, those attacks aren't valid. When the truth is, the science shows a lot of those criticisms that Black women have, some of them are quite valid. I wouldn't say, let's say, a lot of the things that the divestors are saying in terms of some of those criticisms can be valid, but they need to understand scientifically why that behavior pattern exists in men and how we can fix that behavior pattern in the men in our community by dealing with that sex ratio problem. But a lot of us are not on that ultimate scientific level to understand these behaviors that we're going to get into in the next section that can be really harmful to women. So a lot of the women are complaining about something that's legit, but we have to understand it scientifically and not just go ahead and destroy the men. So I hope that helped a bit, Jamaica.
Oh, yes, I love it. Thank you.
Thank you. Just got one more. Oh, okay, we've got two now. So we're going to have to go through these two quite quickly. So if you could keep your questions quite
I will. I'll
brief.
try.
Move on. Questions and answers, yes. So Victoria, would you like to go first with your question, please?
Oh, sure. Thank you. Mine's very brief. Just as a sort of an addition to Jamaica's question, I don't know if there's an answer, Christopher, but why do you think more of our men marry out than the women?
Okay, there's a few things going on there, and I'm going to try and keep the answer short. But I'll first start say you got to buy the book if you want the complete scientific breakdown of that. Now, first, because men, like I said, are influenced by status, and then the standards are physical. So men don't rely on their physical appearance as much as women do. Women are assessed more on their physical appearance. So the beauty standards, that will physically affect a woman more than it does a man. What affects the man is his economic status. So this is why they can look any way they want to. If they pursue and get that high level socioeconomic status, they can attract a lot of women. It doesn't work that way for a woman who pulls up her socioeconomic status. It can tend to be much more about appearance. Now, you kind of have to look at non-Black women as well, in that why are they choosing Black men at a higher rate than, let's say, white men are choosing white women? Because as we move from one race to another, we see vast differences. Because if we look at, let's say, East Asians, it's the Asian women who are disproportionately interracially dating, marrying out, and so forth, whereas the Asian men are much more or less likely to be picked, let's say, by white women or Black women. When they look at this whole interracial pool, they say the big losers are East Asian men and Black women. So that's part of the reason, Black men are chosen, because they're perceived. I mean, I guess some people call it sexual fetishization and things like that. I don't think an evolutionist would call it that. And I did go into great detail in the book. I'm a little scared to put it on video because we do have to get into some delicate areas. There are some things I discussed in the other lectures about perception of Black masculinity and testosterone. Black men are perceived as being like, let's say, the most masculine men on the planet. And some women can be really attracted to that masculinity regardless of their race. And I've seen the tendency for women who are kind of into strong masculinity. Those would tend to be the white or the Asian women or whoever who are going to go after Black men. But you don't get the same with Black women and men of other races. And then we got stereotypes going on. We got a lot of bad cultural perceptions of Black women. So I know I've got to keep the answer short, but really I would recommend the book at this point if you want to get deep down into this note sections with the studies that support the evidence in the book. And there's two, very strong chapters just on those last two questions we got, because it's really complex what's going on there.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. And then last one, Leona, if you'd like to ask your question, please.
Yes, Mr. Gradison. Listen, the low sex ratio among Black people, what do you say is the primary driver? Now, I know you mentioned homicide, disease, racial mass incarceration, 1.5 million Black men missing. What is the primary driver? What's causing this low sex ratio, and what does it have to do with the neo group, the white folks?
Right. So the way the power structures in society are responding to the Black community causes some of that. So when we looked at, the forms of discrimination they could meet with, which we did look a lot of that in the neo group selection thing, it puts pressure on the Black community in several ways, on the men and the women. And so mass incarceration is one of those pressures it puts on them, but there's also in the employment sector, in healthcare, in education. And as these different power structures in society put pressure on that community, it can create that problem with policies, just like the one-child policy in China caused it. You can have policies and behaviors of institutions in the United States evoking and bringing about this low sex ratio within the African-American population. And generally speaking, there's just a more negative response to Black people, and it's incremental and causes problems in several different important domains of society. And that pressure, it causes all kinds of problems.